Late last week, it was reported that the EU's six biggest economies, Germany, France, Italy, Spain, the Netherlands and Poland, had all provisionally signed up to the Industrial Accelerator Act, or IAA, a piece of legislation proposed by the European Commission in March that aims to essentially reverse Europe's deindustrialisation. So in this video, we thought we'd take a look at Europe's alleged deindustrialisation, how the IAA aims to reverse it, and whether it'll actually work. European politicians don't really talk about the energy transition anymore, but that doesn't mean it isn't happening. In fact, Europe has quietly redoubled its effort at decarbonisation. In the latest issue of our magazine, we look at this rare good news and why the energy transition has ended up looking different to the one we envisioned. That's just one of 80 pages in the magazine, because there's more in too long than you'd expect. Purchase your copy by clicking the link in the description. So, before we get into the IAA, let's start by asking the question, has Europe actually deindustrialised? At first glance, the answer seems to be a resounding yes. According to World Bank data, manufacturing's share of GDP in the EU has fallen from 20% in 1990 to more like 14% today. Similarly, manufacturing's share of employment in Europe, that is, the percentage of all employees employed in manufacturing or industry, has fallen from about 20% in 2000 to more like 14% today. This decline hasn't been uniform. In Poland, for instance, manufacturing has held up pretty well, both in terms of its share of GDP and employment, while, on the other end of the spectrum, both Spain and France have suffered quite steep declines on both metrics. Nonetheless, in the aggregate, it's true that manufacturing and industry plays a less central role in the European economy than it once did. This has provoked some anxiety in Brussels and in national governments about Europe's alleged deindustrialisation. These anxieties have been exacerbated by recent events, including the pandemic and Russia's invasion of Ukraine, which has made European policymakers more conscious of the extent to which the European economy relies on imports. At least some policymakers think that more industrial capacity would better protect Europe's economic security, because more industrial capacity would imply more stuff being made in Europe, which means less reliance on imports. However, it's important not to overstate Europe's predicament here. For starters, Europe's deindustrialisation has been less severe than of other similarly developed economies. The US and the UK, for instance, have suffered more acute deindustrialisation, both in terms of GDP and jobs. It's also worth noting that, while manufacturing's share of GDP has been shrinking, this isn't because manufacturing output has actually decreased. Rather, it's just because it's been growing at a slower rate than the rest of the economy, which is centred around services. Since 1990, Europe's manufacturing output, measured by value add, has actually increased by more than 60%. But the service sector has grown by 90% over the same period, which is why manufacturing's share of overall GDP has shrunk. Furthermore, this distinction between manufacturing and services is somewhat misleading, because most big European manufacturers are today what's known as hybrid companies. In other words, they offer services on top of their traditional manufacturing goods. Michelin is a good example. They used to just make and sell tyres, but now an ever-growing share of their revenue comes from maintenance and data services. Anyway, for all these caveats, there is, nonetheless, a widespread consensus in Europe at the moment that the EU needs to re-industrialise. To this end, in March, the European Commission published the first draft of the Industrial Accelerator Act, or IAA, which aims to bring manufacturing's share of GDP back up to 20%. To this end, the IAA will essentially do four things. Two of these four, namely speeding up permits for individual projects and getting member states to boost activity in certain designated sectors, are relatively uncontentious. However, the other two things, namely made in EU requirements and conditions on foreign investment in certain strategic sectors, have proved more controversial. The conditions on foreign investment have proved controversial for two reasons. First, they seem quite squarely directed at China. They only apply to large investments in battery, EV, solar, or critical raw material projects where the foreign investor comes from a country that already accounts for more than 40% of global manufacturing capacity in that sector. In practice, this basically means China, which dominates in all those sectors. Second, the European economy already suffers from a lack of investment, and the stringency of these conditions threatens to exacerbate this problem. Specifically, the IAA would require large investments to meet 4 of 6 criteria.
The foreign investor doesn't own more than 49% of the project. If the investment comes via a joint venture with an EU company, the foreign investor can't have more than 49% stake in the venture. The foreign investor agrees to essentially share their intellectual property with the EU. At least 50% of jobs created go to Europeans, at least 1% of all revenue goes into research and development, and the foreign investor creates a website explaining and justifying how the project will benefit the European economy. These are obviously pretty stringent and somewhat fiddly criteria, hence the anxiety about them deterring further investment in Europe. For their part, the Made in EU regulations have proved controversial, in large part because they violate a long-standing principle of European green policy, namely that green subsidies are supposed to support clean industries irrespective of where products are produced, because, well, they're about getting to net zero as fast as possible. The Made in EU regulations, however, would basically require European governments to spend some fraction of their green subsidies on systems made within the EU, or, in some cases, countries that the EU has an appropriate free trade deal with. So, for example, instead of subsidising a solar farm comprising Chinese-made solar panels, European governments would have to, at least occasionally, subsidise one comprising solar panels made in Europe, even if they're a lot more expensive. This might be good news for European industry, but it will be bad news for both Europe's public finances and its net zero ambitions. Moreover, denying subsidies to the cheapest and most easily deployable renewables might actually push up European energy costs, which could, paradoxically, end up hurting European industry. The final criticism to be made of the IAA is that its staged target of bringing manufacturing's share of GDP back up to 20% is both unrealistic and a bit arbitrary. It's unrealistic both because it would imply reversing a decades-long trend and creating an EU-wide economy that's more reliant on industry than Germany is today, without really spending that much money. It's arbitrary because manufacturing's share of GDP is as much about the rest of the economy as it is about manufacturing. In other words, if the rest of the European economy does well, then manufacturing's share of GDP will naturally shrink. In this light, the Commission would perhaps be better off setting an absolute rather than relative target. Now, to be clear, we're not trying to imply at all that the IAA is a bad policy per se, but it clearly makes some uncomfortable trade-offs. Ultimately, this just reflects the fact that the EU is in a tough spot here. As other developed countries like the US has found out, reindustrialisation is just very difficult, especially when you've got competing policy objectives like net zero and strained public finances, as most European governments do. The latest issue of our magazine is out now, and if you want our best value ever, subscribing and using code SUMMER26 gets you your first copy for as cheap as £4.99, as well as 20% off as long as you stay subscribed. I told you about one of the articles at the start of this video, but this issue's truly jam-packed with content from all around the world. Obviously, the headline section is our rundown of Trump's wars around the world, discussing all of the different countries and regions which have faced Trump's military wrath, going nation by nation through the timeline, and reaching the ultimate question, has Trump created the modern holy war? From there, we dive into our regional sections, starting with the UK, where we unpack the results of the recent elections, take a look at the UK's odd foreign posture, and discuss if Britain has become ungovernable. Then, in the EU section, we discuss how Russia's sphere of influence is fading, why Europe's energy transition isn't what you expect, as well as looking at the Euro's missing members. Finally, in the global section, we discuss if we're seeing echoes of the First World War, what's next for Iran, as well as what really came from the Gen Z protests we saw emerging last year. That's not even everything. With this 80-page issue, our joint longest ever, there's even more to read than I've even been able to mention here. So click the link in the description to learn more and grab your copy today.